Hey, it's Amir Creator, and today I'm going to be showing two ways to finish wood. One that is so simple anyone could do, and a much better option that is a little bit more complicated. Plus testing both of them to their breaking point. This is what I'll be using for the beginner option. It is an unfinished tabletop from a previous project. The surface was rough, so before starting the finishing process, I sanded it with 120 grit sandpaper. Now the sanding options are to sand by hand with sandpaper, a sanding sponge, a sanding block, or a power tool like this random orbital sander. The result will be the same, the only factor being how much time and effort it takes. A smooth surface will serve as a foundation for a smooth finish. So after going over the whole table with 120, I switched to 320 grit, which will make it even smoother. For those who are curious about what those numbers actually mean, it basically comes down to how many grains of abrasive there are glued to a given area of the paper. The more of these there are, the smaller they are, meaning the finish will be smoother. In other words, high number equals smooth. This is the finish I'll be using for the first option, boiled linseed oil. There are basically two categories when it comes to finishing wood. They are penetrating oil versus film. I'll talk more about the film one later in the video, but the penetrating oil does just that. It soaks into the wood and stops things from getting into it. Most of these products also polymerize and add a little bit of strength to the top layer. However, it's best utilized when the wood is already on the harder side. I like to pour the oil into a sriracha bottle for easier application. And speaking of the application, it could not be simpler. All I do is cover the surface liberally and then spread it around with a rag. You can really see how the oil absorbs into the wood with the end grain here. While I was here, I also prepared this comparison board for the torture test at the end of the video. After absorbing for a few minutes, these patches might appear on the more porous areas, so it's just a matter of going over them again with the rag. It doesn't have to be perfect, and after going over the patches a few times, I take a clean rag and soak up all the excess oil. After letting it sit and dry for a few hours, the first method is done. I love using this method because it doesn't use many chemicals. Also, it's super quick and simple. An important note here is to not discard your rags right away. Let them dry first. Rags soaked in boiled linseed oil have been known to catch on fire from the drying process, which is really just a chemical reaction. It's not a big deal though, just let them dry somewhere non-flammable like a concrete surface. So that's the beginner one. Now let's do the more complicated finishing method. This is a table commissioned by a friend of mine, and it's going to be the canvas of the second finishing method, which is water-based polyurethane. And by the way, if you're getting value out of this video, consider subscribing to the channel. Again, I sanded the tabletop with 120 grit first before going over again with 320 grit. This polyurethane is the second type of finish I was talking about, a film finish, meaning there will be a layer of plastic on top of the wood. A side note here, film finishes can also be oil-based, but that just refers to the solvent and it's different from the oil in this. Getting rid of the dust with this method is more important. So on top of using a brush, I wiped it down with a lint-free cloth until there was no more dust showing up on it. For a really good finish, sometimes I use a tack cloth, but a good substitute is to just vacuum the surface. I use a soft 2-inch brush, and starting from the middle of the table, I go all the way out to one side. By the way, I have links to all the products used in this video in the description. Once one side is covered, I come back and go to the other side. Depending on the size of the surface, I dip my brush multiple times. It's okay to have some bunched up finish because once I do about 2 rows, I like to come back with a feathering stroke. This is a very light pass meant to spread out the finish evenly. I also like to put a light in front of the area I'm working because the glare will show me exactly what's going on. As for the sides, I like to switch to a foam brush because I find it easier to apply the finish without getting it on the top. Depending on the temperature and humidity of the area, it could take between 20 minutes to a couple hours for the finish to dry in between coats. I'm going to do a total of 3 coats here, and in between coats I put my brushes in a sealed bag to prevent them from drying out. Oh, and remember the test board I started earlier? I also put a coat on that as well. This is what it looks like after the first coat. In the summer, I only wait 20 minutes between coats, but after an hour, I came back to a dry first coat. And with 320 grit sandpaper, I very lightly sanded the surface. The point of sanding the coats is to lightly scuff the surface and to remove any bumps that may have been stuck in the finish. Your hand is the best tool for finding the bumps on the surface, and that's why you see me rubbing my hand on the area I just sanded. In this clip, you can really see just how lightly I sanded. Again, the goal is not to remove the finish we just put on. It's for scuffing up the surface for better adhesion of the layers, and to remove the bumps that have dried in the finish. After sanding the surface, I use a clean lint-free rag to remove the dust. The second coat is a repeat of the first one, starting from the middle and going to each edge, then feathering out the rows. If I get any dripping, I make sure to work it back into the paint or clean it up in order to prevent the drips from drying. This is what it looks like after the second coat. Polyurethane has its good and bad sides. One downside is that it can feel plasticky to the touch, but that's also good because that means the surface is protected. Normally I don't put on more than 3 coats, and once this one dried, I called it done. But sometimes if there's not enough coverage or there are bumps, I do more coats. Here's what it looks like after the third coat. A huge advantage of the polyurethane being water-based means I can just wash my brush with dish soap and water and have it ready for next time. Okay, so I just spent all this time showing you my 2 favorite finishing methods. But which one's better? Well, it looks like they're both susceptible to a screwdriver attack, but the one with just oil, the actual wood is scratched, whereas most of the damage on the polyurethane one is on the surface layer. But what will happen if some water is set on these scratched surfaces and then forgotten about for an hour? Well, as you might have guessed, the scratched area absorbed more water on both sides. However, it looks like just letting the surfaces dry makes it look like nothing even happened. Okay, water is one thing, but what if the liquid has some color to it? I read somewhere that tea is actually even more staining than coffee. So after letting the tea dry overnight, I checked out the damage. The stains on the polyurethane cleaned up perfectly with just some water. And it may look like it's stained here on the oil side, but it's actually just wet. You'll see the spot disappears as the tests go on. Also at this point I realized that the test would be worthless if I didn't have a control. So I also stained an unfinished piece of wood. After cleaning it the same way, it seems that it was actually stained. So I'm gonna say the point goes to both of them on this test as well, which I'm not sure if they can keep getting away with ties here because the next test is what I call, oops, I missed the paper, involving a pencil and a Sharpie. The pencil came off easily enough with just an eraser for both finishes as well as the unfinished wood. However, the Sharpie test was a whole nother story. I knew that normally a dry erase marker can be used to erase Sharpie marks, but it turned out to be a huge mistake here and just added more pigment. That's a fail for both of them. That would have been a fail for all 3 of them, but I remember I had some acetone which, to my surprise, worked wonders on the poly side, and somewhat for the oil, but not so much for the control. The only thing is I think it also damaged the finish on the poly side, so I guess that's half a point to poly. Alright, at this point I wanted to see some destruction. So after adding some rusty nuts and bolts, I pretty much tap dance on top of them to get the most out of this test. And again, other than a few dents and scratches here and there was not much damage to the surfaces. I guess what this test really proved is that what matters more than the finish is the type of wood that is used. For this test, I moved everything outside because it's going to involve fire. I held the torch on the unfinished wood for exactly 10 seconds to act as the control. And not surprisingly, fire plus wood equals burnt wood. I know this test is pretty unrealistic, but I was still curious to see if the finish did anything to protect the surfaces against extreme temperature like this, so I repeated the test for both finishes as well. At first glance, they all looked about the same, but I noticed the char wasn't as deep on the poly side, so I guess it did something. In conclusion, both finishes have their strengths and weaknesses, but which one's your favorite? Thanks for watching, bye.